Ivy, how did you meet your husband?
Oh, well, my husband was a lad in the village. He was much older than me. I never once thought about him as a sweetheart. Truthfully, he knew me, he liked me, and he used to play the violin. And he could play it quite nicely, really. Nothing too hard. And he used to come and play down at Vinny's place because our grandfather used to love for him to come and play the violin and Vinny play the piano. And then I learnt how to play the piano. And he used to come to my house later when I left school and teach me some of the notes of that on the piano. And I could then later on, I could play something that he could play on the violin. Of course, he was much older than me, and I never thought of him as anything but a friend. But he used to chase Finny and me round the garden and catch us sometimes in something. Anyhow, it was great fun. And then, of course, the war came. He was 6 years older than me, 12, 13, 14, 18. Yes, he was at work. He was learning to be a carpenter. And then we used to meet and we'd walk round to Sunday school together. That's how we got to know each other so better. He'd wait for me on the top of the hill there, and he knew I was coming to Sunday school, and he'd wait for me. And he used to talk about where he'd been to on the night before, to the pictures and things like that. Talk to me. And he'd tease me because I had a hymn book in my hand. And he used to tease me and knock the book flying out of my hands and tell me to go and reach it. I got to know him very well. Then the war came, and he told me that he was going to volunteer. He said, I'm not leaving until the last. He said, I'm going to volunteer for the Royal Flying Corps. He said, that's the thing for the future, aeroplanes. I didn't know what aeroplane was, I don't think, not properly then. I'd never seen an aeroplane. He said, I'm going to volunteer for that if they'll have me. Well, it appeared he did look later on when the time came. He did volunteer and he got accepted in the Royal Flying Corps. And then he was called up. And then I went away to live with my mother because Auntie had died. And I came back here one day to Vinny's place for a holiday. And I went to see my husband's mother, Mrs. Wager, who was always so kind to me when I was a little girl. She used to make toffee to sell. Sell. Oh dear, that was a laugh. You went to her door and asked for a pennyworth of toffee. You'd get the toffee and the penny back. She must have made a fortune. I always had my penny back and a bag of toffees as well. Anyhow, I went to see her. And she said, I wish you would write to our Reg. He'd be so pleased to hear from you. I was 16 then, look. And I said, all right then, you give me where I've got to write to, and I will write to him. And she said, that's a promise. I said, yes, if you will give me his address, I'll write to him. And she did. It was somewhere in the Royal Flying Corps British Expedition. It was to France. And I did write to him. And I had a lovely letter back saying how pleased he was to hear that I'd been down to Whiteshill and had a holiday, and he'd been to see his mother, and his mother had given me this address. And he said, I'm writing back now. I hope you'll answer this letter. And I did. And then one letter led to another, and I found we were writing to each other regularly, and it was nice. And then he came home on leave. That was in 1916, I think it was. I was 16. He came home on Christmas leave, and we met. And it was so nice because it was like meeting an old friend. And it went on from there. We kept corresponding, and we corresponded right up until the end. And then later on, when he was coming out of the army, I'd been down here again. I was 18 then, and I'd been to stay with Vinnie's people. And Vinnie, she was away, I think, at Birmingham then. And I went there, and I came down here, and we met down here. And it seemed it just simply fell into place somehow. But he had to go back, because he was home on leave. At Christmas, he went back. That was at the end of the war, 1918, and I had to go back on Christmas Eve. And I remember going to Victoria Station, seeing him off on Christmas Eve. And he was going back to France. And he was talking, he didn't know what was happening. He said there's all sorts of rumours going about. He said we don't know what to believe. He said, I think it's too early yet for any of them to make up their mind. But they seem to think that we should be disbanded. And he said, if so, he said I should be coming home. And then, out of the blue, the postman came in one day and gave me a letter. And he said, "Tuppence to pay, miss." And I said, "Tuppence to pay for a letter from France?" And he said, "It's not from France." And I said, "Oh, not from France." But I said, "It is writing." He said, "It's not from France." He said, "You got to pay me tuppence." He said, "There's no stamp on that letter." Of course there wasn't. And I said, I paid the tuppence, and I opened it, and it was a scrappy bit of paper saying, I'm home in England somewhere. Don't know where. Will let you know as soon as possible. And one day he just walked in, and he'd been transferred, and he was discharged from there. And that's when we got married and come back to live here at Whiteshill.
Mm.
Yeah.
So he had a house here, did he? Or did he have his mother's? Where did you stay when you came back to live with him in Whiteshill?
Oh, his mother and father were alive. They lived here. Yeah, and so they were in the village then, but they were in a different house. One time they lived at Ruscombe. There's 2 or 3 houses in the village they lived.
And did you stay with his mother and father?
Yes, I stayed here. And then it was quite a long time, 18 months after that, I think, that he had an offer of a job in Leeds. Work was very hard. 1922, 21 and 2. A lot of people were out of work and couldn't get a job. And his uncle wrote down and said, "Come on up to Leeds. There's plenty of work up here. And we can put you up till you can find a place." And we did. We went up. We packed up and we went to Leeds to live. And we did find a place. And we were quite happy there for a while. I don't want to go into what happened in Leeds because my husband suffered very much for what he had to put up with the war because he was gassed. And he suffered very much with asthma. Leeds didn't suit him. And the doctor said, there's only one place for you to go, and that's to go back to your native place. And that was here. And we packed up and we came down here, and we bought a cottage here, and we came to stay here. Because of his health, which he was better, but he used to have these dreadful attacks. He'd go to work one morning looking all right, but he'd be brought back half dead by dinner time, couldn't breathe. And that happened so many times. But somehow, I don't know, we managed. And he went on struggling with his breath. He had an inhaler that he had to use constantly, a hand inhaler. Brovon, it was called Brovon, the stuff he used.
Did it help?
Yes, it did help, and it was a great help. But he died quite nicely. One morning, he'd been very poorly, and I went and bent over him, and he cut hold of my hand and held it. And I held his too. And he said, I don't want to go back in hospital again, Ivy. And I said, all right, dear, you shan't go back in hospital. He said, I didn't like it in hospital. I said, I know. I said, but you wanted to go, you know. You said you want. He said, I know, but I don't want to go again. And he held my hand tight, and he just passed away.